Very warm welcome everyone to this sixth webinar for INTBAU's Architecture Challenge. My name is Harriet Wenberg and I am Executive Director of INTBAU, which is a global network dedicated to creating better places to live. You're joining us from 33 different countries today, so Albania, Germany, New Zealand, Pakistan and Sweden, just to name a few. The INTBAU Architecture Challenge is a competition for low carbon, no carbon and carbon negative designs for resilient and adaptable houses. The design competition is open for your submissions from now until the 9th of May. And all details on how to register and how to submit a design proposal are online at challenge.intbau.org. And there'll be cash prizes for selected entries. And we also want them to work with winners to look for opportunities to construct and test their designs in the contexts for which they're intended. These webinars are going to continue until next May so that there's as much resource as possible to help everyone with preparing really strong design submissions. And these will all just help, hopefully, to encourage and guide your entries to the competition. But today's session will focus on the subject at the heart of the Architecture Challenge, which is homes, shelters, houses, and housing. Our planet is host to an extraordinary diversity of building traditions, which in turn shape the shelters that keep us safe from the elements. As we progress further into the decade of action towards achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the world seems to have an equal number and variety of shortages and crises relating to housing and the places we call home. Whether problems relate to access, quantity, or quality, too many of us are without resilient and adaptable houses. Today's four speakers will set the global scene and share case studies to demonstrate how shortages and crises can be addressed. We'll then move to discussion and questions from you, our participants, and you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I move to our first speaker for this session. It's Dr. Orna Rosenfeld. Orna is a housing advisor, research scientist, and author. She is expert in international housing policy, knowledge and investment, sustainable development, urban governance, and strategy, all as prerequisites for inclusive urban growth. Orna's work covers 56 countries, and she advises governments, cities, and organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the European Commission. Orna, over to you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I would like to say greetings from Paris to everyone. I will try to share my presentation now. Today I would like to share with you the key results of the research that examine the impact of COVID-19 crisis on housing systems in high-income economies. Particularly, I would like to look at the employment trends, construction trends, what happened in Proptech, and potential, and ask a little bit about this potential migrations from cities and to rural areas. I would just like to underline that this research that I will be presenting today, or the key results of it, I conducted for the European Investment Bank as the part of their efforts to include social and affordable housing into their sustainability awareness bonds, therefore really creating a first international bond that is dedicated to housing specifically. So without further ado, I would like to start with the first strand, which is employment. COVID-19 has laid bare the economic and housing inequalities. And that is the reason it is important to look at employment projections. Another important reason to look at employment at this time is because the trends in employment provide an underlying information about the immediate future of the housing consumption. Although COVID-19 affects the entire world, the pressure is not evenly distributed among all people and all places. What we see is that impact of the crisis is particularly impacting the people in most vulnerable subcategories of the working population, with low wage earners suffering losses 3 to 6 times larger than high wage earners. And that is the statistics for Europe and the UK together. If we're looking at the high income economies generally and look at the OECD data, we see that top 25% of earners have lost their jobs. Only in 14% of the high, if you could correct myself, only 14% of top 25% earners have lost their jobs, in comparison to 30% of the bottom 25% earners. The particular groups that are affected are women and low-paid workers, part-time, temporary, and self-employed, as well as part-time workers, young people. And here, what is important to note is that there are serious concerns that the pandemic will plunge the COVID-19 generation into a dark age of declining mobility because of rising economic and educational inequalities. So from here, I would like to move to key trends related to construction. Just to illustrate the trends related to current production of housing. The construction sector, as you probably know, has been heavily impacted by the crisis, although there have been differences between the countries, as the graph shows in case of Europe and the UK. The current data suggests that the activities is expanding, but from a very low level, with delays, continuing distancing requirements, and disrupted supply chains, as well as increasing prices of materials. In many countries, it will take some time before residential construction reaches pre-COVID volumes. And here I would just like to emphasize that if we're looking at the trends before the COVID-19 crisis or since the global financial crisis, the high income economies have seen the drop of production or supply of housing, and therefore we are looking at shortages that existed before the pandemic. In the countries where the construction has been heavily impacted, like here in France, the concern that the backlog in supply will add to the housing shortages is grand, and therefore we fear worsening of access to housing for those in need. On the positive note, the crisis may ultimately prove to be the catalyst for radical change in the construction industry in terms of digitalization and prefabrication, as well as commitment to environmental objectives. However, considering the scale of the impact the construction industry has suffered, it is likely that these positive goals will take time to be implemented. Now, I would like to move from here to Proptech, or property technology, that has advanced rapidly during the crisis, and in complete contrast to the construction industry. Why am I noting this? These trends in Proptech are very important in terms of consumption of housing. The digital practices that have been experimental just in the beginning of 2020 are becoming accepted, or are already accepted and are mainstream. These practices are likely to enable easier international consumption of and investment in housing, as they enable remote viewing and buying of real estate. It is important that these practices support positive social impact in housing markets, in addition to the commercial benefit that they can secure. I would like to move now to housing prices. The available data suggests that the long-lasting effects of COVID-19 crisis on home prices may be very limited to none. This is a complete contrast to the results of global financial crisis. If we are looking at Europe, for example, in all except 2 European countries, the housing prices continued to grow on average in the first and second quarter of 2020, The similar statistics are available for 2021, and this was regardless of the lockdown we all experienced. In Poland and Luxembourg, we saw a two-digit housing price increase during the pandemic, with a 10.9 and 13.4% of housing price increase on national level, respectively. Here, it is very important to note as well, if we're thinking about supply of housing, that housing price change plays out differently in different submarkets. We can see that in the example of Spain, and this is one of the graphs we have here on the slide, and that raises questions about the territorial development and how we supply housing in high and low demand markets. I think that the concern that has been shared in most of the high income economies is that the property sector may end up being a two-tier property sector, in which those with insecure jobs or small deposits find it harder than ever to buy a home. And that is very important if we are contrasting this data with the employment trends that we saw in the beginning. I would like to move then to urban to rural migrations. And I put a question mark here because I believe that there is much more work to be done to understand what in fact is going on. The future of remote work is clearly a very important trend in the view of COVID-19. A number of commentators expect significant urban to rural migrations. It is also expected that these migrations will have important implications for the future of housing production and consumption in both rural and urban areas. I have to just note that the same commentators often at the beginning of the pandemic assume that the housing prices will drop because of the rise of remote work, but that didn't happen. So at this juncture, I think that there is more work to be done to understand the actual scale and nature of these assumed migrations, and that there are still some critical questions that remain to be answered. And I just give examples of a couple of them that came up in my research. And first of all is, what will be the long-term telework policies adopted by companies? How many companies will adopt them and where? Also, it is important, the important questions to ask is who will be able to move, in fact, in terms of population. Important point to consider is that noted potential migrations may affect different population groups differently. We have a digital divide where access to telework is considerably more widespread among well-paid individuals that kept their jobs, in contrast to the low-wage earners who were more likely to lose it. And we have to remind ourselves that the low-wage workers that may have been eligible for mortgages would not be eligible anymore after 1 or 2 years of loss of employment. The question also remains, where will employees be able to move and how far from employment centers? There is a digital divide that we must consider on territorial level, and that divide concerns countries, their countries' regions and sub-regions. And these will have an important impact on the future of potential urban to rural migration in different countries and within them. And what I mean by this is that countries are digitally developed in a different way, especially if we're looking at Europe. But if we are looking at a specific country can have regions that are more or less digitally developed, and the latest data shows that rural areas usually are not as well connected as the employment centers, for example. So these questions remain. So just to summarize, the trends that we absolutely can confirm that exist are a construction sector that has been impacted very, very heavily. with supply chains and prices of materials being impacted disproportionately. Proptech that has been developing and raising in prominence, housing prices that have been increasing in contrast to, in general terms and averages, in contrast with that trends of global financial crisis, employment that has been plummeting, and inequality that has been increasing since the pandemic. Now, as a conclusion, I would just like to say that despite of all the hardships it brought, the COVID-19 crisis presents a rare opportunity to rethink the way we work and live, to rethink how we build our homes, shelters, houses, and housing in general, and make them more adapted to current and evolving housing needs, as well as resilient and environmentally friendly. This crisis has shown us also how fragile and complex our supply chains are in construction industry, and to what extent the local construction industry and housing building depends on them. It emphasized the importance of local and locally available materials, and the importance of recycling and circularity, as well as traditional methods to provide housing. To my opinion, the COVID-19 brings the INTBAU initiative in context. It emphasizes its importance. The traditional materials, the locally available materials, and the methods are important and can be used to counteract the shortage of materials and disrupted supply chains, provide housing more sustainably, housing adapted to local climates, and therefore with less carbon emissions. They can also encourage recycling and reuse of local and locally available materials. In many ways, the tradition INTBAU fosters and direction it wishes to further develop is more relevant now than it was before the pandemic. A critical question, however, remains is the scale and scalability of the solutions that will be proposed. But nonetheless, I think, and I strongly believe that this is the momentum to build on when contemplating the possibilities in evolving housing systems to respond to current and future housing needs. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Harriet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Orna. That extraordinary amount of research, knowledge, and information that you're showing and raising points that I know the rest of our speakers today will also pick up on, and lots there for questions at the end. Thank you, Orna, very much. A fantastic start. Our next speaker, Marianne Cusato, is renowned for her work on innovative housing solutions for disaster recovery and workforce housing. And in addition to her work as the partner in charge of design and development at Cyprus Community Development Corporation, Marianne also teaches on faculty at the University of Notre Dame. And her advocacy and designs have earned recognition and awards, including developing the designs that formed the basis of the United States Congress's development of a $400 million alternative emergency housing program. Marianne, I can see you're already ready to go. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. And this is a really exciting group to talk to. So when I started putting this presentation together, thinking about what would I want to know if I was entering a design competition. That's the lens that this presentation is given through. I have put together several images that illustrate case studies of my work, building on this disaster housing idea. When we started doing our work after Katrina, the work that we did at the time really stood on the shoulders of giants of the new urbanism, of the work that INTBAU is doing in looking at how we create place, at the same time create affordable housing options. And I've been really working on trying to crack the code for that ever since. The image that you see here on the screen are some houses. I'll talk about them a little bit later, that we did with Habitat for Humanity, building the Wildfire Cottages, recovering from the wildfires back a couple of years ago. And what we found throughout this process is, first of all, there's no silver bullet. But second of all, it's all a balancing act. For the architecture students that are watching and the architects, we actually looked to Vitruvius, the first recorded architect, for inspiration. Because everything, when you pull one lever, it pushes another. And so we're trying to figure out what is our value set? How do we approach this? So within my company, this is something that really is a core value of what we do, is that we try to, in the words of Vitruvius, find firmness, commodity, and delight. Translated to modern day, that is affordability, resiliency, and beauty. The balancing piece of this is that it's really easy to get one of these. You can absolutely have a resilient building if you don't care what it looks like and you have all the money in the world. You can have a beautiful building if you don't care whether it's resilient, and you can pay whatever you want. And you can have an affordable building that's going to be pretty ugly and probably not very resilient. You can get two of these without too much effort. It's the three together that really make you sort of really push and pull, as I was mentioning before, to find that point that matters. The point that everything gives a little, but all of it comes together to create a greater whole. In addition to these, we have a secondary layer of it, which is affordability, quality, and time, because the time piece of it is really critical in anything, in trying to actually get the affordability, in time, trying to meet these enormous housing issues that we have. Most of my work is domestic. We actually did a project, which I'll talk about a little bit, in Barbados with the Princess Foundation. All of it is based in disaster areas. So time is a critical piece of it. Trying to get in, trying to help after a crisis. What we're finding, though, is we're going into these areas that the crisis was there the day before the storm. It's magnified after. And we look at these communities that were already suffering without affordable housing, without safe housing. Very often, the disaster happened and was magnified because the houses that were there were not resilient and were not ready for the disasters that arrived. We see, especially in our coastal areas, out west, in the desert areas, and in California, now up into Oregon, we see areas where millions of homes are at risk and in high risk areas. So this work can also be applied to mitigating and getting ahead of disasters. And so that really becomes, this is really the issue of our lifetime, is how do we address when we know we're in very high risk areas, we know we've built buildings that are not capable of withstanding what we know will come. We don't know where the disaster will happen next, but we do know it will happen, and they will continue to grow in magnitude. We have really tough decisions to make as a global society about where we build, what we build, and the very hard questions of who gets saved. We do not have the resources to save everyone. And it's a very, very difficult decisions. The Florida Keys already are, the Florida Department of Transportation said there are streets there that they can't afford to raise. The first few times that happens is going to go to lawsuits, but at a certain point, we have finite resources. So every building that we build, every community that we build, we must consider that. We must consider whether we should be building. And these are really the questions of our time. As you're working in a competition, be thinking about that. Be thinking about where as well as what and how. One of the things that we struggle with in my company is energy efficiency versus resiliency. We have a market that we're trying to meet, and fundamentally, the amount of money we spend on a project has to be limited to what we can sell or rent it for. The market conditions will dictate. We are always at the top of the affordable bracket or the economic bracket. We're not high end, but we will never be the cheapest. We're proud of the fact that we will never be the cheapest, but we have to make hard decisions. And we recently just had a lengthy sort of internal exercise trying to figure out, should we spend the money on energy efficiency or should we spend it on resiliency? What's the benefit of the beauty piece of it? In this case specifically, we're building in Florida. And if we had had the most energy efficient option, we would have had to do a slab on grade and not have hurricane windows. We're going to lose the the usable porch. It was going to go back. We were working with someone that was proposing the porch be just, non-usable at 3 feet, which to us was a non-starter. And so if we're going to put a porch on, it had to work. And then we were balancing, do we raise it up? Do we put the hurricane windows? In this case, we chose resiliency over energy efficiency, because you can have a really sustainable and energy efficient building, but if it's not resilient, I make the argument that it's not actually sustainable. But these are the issues. So the performance of the building meets the code, but it doesn't exceed in as many places as we would want. And these are the tough decisions you're going to have to make, because especially even in a competition, it's really easy to put everything in, put all the bells and whistles. But the reality of the budget overlaid with that is actually where the interesting conversations can start. If you can't have everything, what do you put in? My business is constantly looking at the delivery system. Before we design a building, we consider how it's built. In the US, most buildings are site built with stick frame. You build a bunch of 2x4s. We use 2x6s. All the bits and pieces come disassembled and they're put together on site. That creates a lot of areas where there's inefficiency, waste of materials. You're limited by the weather. If it's raining, you're not working before you have the roof on. So you have constraints that we believe add cost to the process. So we are looking at kit homes, we're looking at panelized homes, and modular to see how we can bring a building to the site faster. Ironically, sadly, it always ends up in recently that site building, even with its inefficiencies, is more affordable, and it allows us to go further with resiliency and energy efficiency than the other pieces. And this was one of the levers. Most recently, we were trying to utilize panelized several. We actually looked at 3 different panelized systems for some houses. And if we had added that in, it was going to take away something else. And so while we're very much sort of desperately trying to make that value proposition work, in the end, if it makes the house too expensive for the people that we're trying, the workforce housing, the people that we're trying to provide housing for, then the panels are there just to make ourselves feel better. And so they're not actually helping. And this is really the trick. Eventually somebody's going to crack the code at this, but it's not there yet. And that's something we're pursuing. So this is a series of projects. This was the Katrina Cottages. We built about 480 of them throughout the state of Louisiana. You see on the side of the screen here, several, they were delivered in different systems. There were SIPS panels, which is the foam sandwich with the OSB board, which is the wood, kind of basically wood and glue. Extremely energy efficient and also very sturdy. These were metal framed. I love the idea of a panelized system. Panelized systems mean that you can approve a shop drawing and that's what turns up on site. It eliminates places for things to go wrong. There were also several modular ones. These were built with a limited set of plans where we changed the facade. We used 3 windows in the entire portfolio of all of the designs, and we used the same trim. We had 6 designers working on it, and I put a little kit of materials together, and everybody had to pick from that, which meant that our window order could be just a massive window order. They weren't framing multiple sizes. There was a first floor window, a second floor window, and a specialty small sort of bathroom kitchen window. And that was it. And so we got maximum variability. I mean, these are all the same plans. There's 6 houses that made up all of these designs. And through detailing and paint and a little bit of trim, we were able to create enough variety that formed the backdrop of that outdoor room, because each house didn't have to have everything. This was a project that we actually did modular in New Jersey after Sandy. This was fantastic. So the modular system, if you're thinking about modular, there's a lot there that's amazing. It is not an industry that is necessarily ready to produce houses that look great. So it's definitely a struggle, but in terms of the efficiency, they can build a house with 2 residential garbage cans of waste. I mean, and if you consider most construction sites, there's a lot more than that. So they have each of the bits and pieces. One person's job is just to cut. The next person's job is to put those pieces together. They each position has its single job. If you go on a job site, one person is doing multiple things, which means there's a lot of places where things can go wrong. It's a lot of waste that can get built into it. The end result, not exactly aesthetically pleasing to me. I have to show my original drawing next to the built drawing because I don't want anyone to think I actually designed what ended up being built. So there's definitely a translation issue with a lot of modular that's very difficult to work through. But if you're a student and you're considering joining this competition and looking at modular, somebody's going to figure this out at some point. So it might as well be one of us. So go for it. Another way that we looked at building, these were the Wildfire Cottages, the images that we had at I had the beginning of the slide. There was a foam system that was, I mean, it was amazing. It's perfect for fire and for earthquakes. And that's the other thing is each area is going to have its own, for us, disasters, and most places do have some disaster. I mean, we go to the disaster area, but you have to calibrate your design to meet those needs. So we have, in this case, a foam and steel building, so there's nothing to burn. And it also works well with earthquakes. This is an example of the SIPS panels. And in this case, we actually had the panels pre-finished. There's sheetrock that came out of the facility. The windows, the doors were in it. We didn't have any wiring or plumbing, but this is a system that we are really hoping to explore more, where the whole wall just comes, and it's a 48-foot building, this one, and it just came in 2 chunks. So 2 24-foot chunks came, windows, everything in it. The building was closed in just a couple days, and they were able to move pretty quickly with that. And this is the end result. This is a combination. So this is one of the foam ones. This is a foam one. This is a SIPS, and this is a SIPS. We did not like the foam system. And actually, while they say they're very efficient, when they cut it, all the little beads go everywhere. So I now really try and avoid those. But somebody, there's interesting ones out there. That's the thing, is there's a lot of systems out there, especially internationally. Fewer of them have made it to the US to make it through all of the testing requirements. But when you go overseas, there's definitely a lot of them. I would take caution with the ones that have foam in them if you're trying to do something with that. While they rate really well energy-wise and engineering-wise, I really sort of question when you're cutting foam how sustainable you can be. We went to the island of Barbados. So, and this was a tricky one where we worked with the community to try and figure out what to build and how to build, because everything had to be brought in. There were no local materials. And that's something within the US. We don't really have anything local. It doesn't exist. You can't build with local materials, because even if you go to the local store, they're bringing it in from somewhere else. If you're lucky, it's from the United States, but a lot of times it's overseas. So we have to work with what we can get. And in this case, we were trying to bring in the most efficient thing we could think, which was a SIPS panel with fiberglass, which would be really sustainable. It would also be something, this is all cut off-site, so you don't have any of the foam beads going around. But you have, it would be able to move. They have both earthquakes and hurricanes, which is tricky because for an earthquake, you want your building to move, and for a hurricane, you want it to be still. So the engineering for that can get complex. They had typically what they build with there is concrete block, and the concrete block buildings that they built very often did not have rebar, and they failed. But the community saw it as a sturdy material. The government and the housing authority loved the idea of bringing in these panels, but the community, as soon as they heard about it, they just said, well, you can build those houses, we will not step inside them. So we had to regroup. We were going to do poured in place concrete walls, which actually would have been absolutely amazing. But in the process of going back and forth, it was determined that that was going to be too expensive, and there were a lot of politics and dynamics. And that's one of the things, you know, it's harder if you're thinking as a student, as you're doing this competition, you know, you're creating an idealized condition, which is great. As you get out and as you start working on stuff, you have to be semi-fluid and figure out what is a given and what is a variable. For us, there were certain givens in this. The engineering was a given, the character of the buildings was a given, and the variable we allowed to be the delivery system. Of course, the delivery system will dictate what the engineering is and what the aesthetic is. And so you just have to think about everything in givens and variables, think about where you can be flexible, and then what that does back to the other design. Community involvement is key. In this case, engineering wise, the best thing to do was the panels. But I can see why somebody who's used to having a concrete building, even if it was an unsafe concrete building, is going to look at that and say, well, you know, when the next hurricane comes, you're not going to be on this island with us. They're looking at us and saying that. And of course, we're not. We're going to be safe on the mainland somewhere. And so I can absolutely see why a letter from my engineer saying that's a safe building wouldn't actually make them feel comfortable. And so we have to think about that. We have to think from the designer's lens, set that aside actually, and say, what does the community need and what's realistic, and be prepared to say, oh, I got it wrong, which is what we did there, and move on to eventually just building with, similar to the idea that like we're building in the US with stick building, the easiest thing to do was what they did there. So it wasn't the inventive thing that we wanted to do. We tested out all the inventive ideas, and then in the end are doing exactly what they typically do there. And we had to find a way to be okay with that instead of sort of imposing our beliefs onto into a situation. Because in the end, if we were able to spend more money on housing, that if we were able to make our money go further, then that was what the goal was. And this is a rendering. Hopefully, at some point in this calendar year, we'll be able to break ground on these houses. This is a cautionary tale. The Brad Pitt houses in New Orleans, they got a lot of media. They are, to my mind at the time, like hideous and immoral in that they were designed by architects that wanted them for their portfolios and didn't really care about the people that lived there. They said they did, but they were, and this one's particularly with the rafters here was actually used the inspiration of the destroyed buildings as a design guide, which just feels in every way wrong. They raised them up higher than they needed to be, but not high enough to be safe. If you were actually going to raise a house up in New Orleans, you would have to go up about to the eave level because the city is below grade. So this was just for really no reason other than to make it look like it was safe, when actually if Lake Pontchartrain comes in again, the whole thing's going underwater. But the result of that was actually very bad urbanism, because there's lots of shades and shadows tucked in there, and it's a place for clutter to build up. And it doesn't make for a safe street. You don't have the Jane Jacobs eyes on the street that you would if the house was down lower. And beyond that, so those were the bad design things, both for the architecture and the urbanism. But beyond that, they used sustainable materials, cutting edge sustainable materials, which on paper sounds good. But if you see this image here, the building rotted away because the sustainable building materials were sustainable to create, but they were not resilient to the hot and humid climate of New Orleans. And these buildings are already being torn down. We were building in right actually next to this site for $135 a square foot all in. These guys were on $400 a square foot, and their buildings within 10 years are being torn down. This is what I'm doing currently. We're in Panama City, Florida. They had Hurricane Michael came through in 2018. And so in my firm now, we're a design and development firm. We were working previously for nonprofits. We've been out in the Florida Keys, out in Sonoma County. But since we've actually started our own development firm in the United States, has a tax break called opportunity zones. So we've been working in opportunity zones, building workforce housing. And and as much as we try and do the R&D to get to a point where we can do off-site panelized or modular, and we're still trying, we're not giving up on that. We're constantly having meetings about how we can make this work. We're going to go down and actually tour some facilities in about a month or so to try and make the value proposition, because we know once we get to scale with that, it would work. It's just getting that first piece to make the value work, because in the end, it's about the person that lives in it. It's not about us. It's not about anything other than creating a safe, livable home that is resilient, as energy efficient as it can be, that someone can afford. And if we're putting too much of ourselves into it, we very quickly get to a place where they can't afford it, because we're already at the top of that by adding the features that we're adding. We didn't have to raise this up. We didn't have to put impact windows in. We didn't have to give a livable outdoor room here. But we found to our value set that was important. And that's where, as you're a designer, as you're navigating this process, think about that. Where's your value set? These are ours, and it's not to say they're the ones for you. It's just where we ended up. And we talk a lot about it to try and figure out where we are and if we're in the right place. And I think as any designer, that's our role, is to make sure that we keep asking those questions of ourselves and of our team, of our contractors, of everyone involved, to make sure that our compass is still headed in the right direction. And this is one of the houses we've completed 4 of them. We have another one under construction, and then we have about 70 units in our pipeline right now, with as much of the missing middle housing as we can get in. We have duplexes, ADUs, townhouses. Every time we try and do a 4-plex, it somehow doesn't end up penciling out. So we've pulled away from that. This is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath. We're also doing a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. And so over the course of the next few years, we'll have about 75 to 100 units in Panama City. And we're also now expanding into Baton Rouge. So my final image here, I do design buildings that look in another way, look different. But I wanted to end with the variation on a theme of the same building, because the part of the inspiration of this was the Sears and Roebuck houses, the kit order homes from the turn of the century up until World War II, that took the same plan, changed it, adapted it for climate, adapted it for culture, and built in different places, but the bones of the building were the same. Now this is these two happen to be the same plan, the exact same plan. This is in the state of Washington. This one is in Mississippi. This and this are actually very similar. This is an outlier. This is also in Mississippi. This is one of the cottages out in Sonoma, Panama City. This is Florida Keys. I have some moral problems with my own work there, and we are no longer working in the Keys. I want to build at least a 100-year home. I hope it's more than that. And while I believe that that home will be a 100-year home, I don't believe that the Florida Keys will be there. I think that you will be reaching this boat by water in 100 years, or reaching this house by water in 100 years. And so personally, and my business, we are not continuing our work there because it's too high. It's too high risk, and we're putting limited and finite resources into a place that won't be there. We did work there. We built 4 homes, but it's something that we take very seriously, is the investment that these homes are, the embodied energies that go into it, what they're offering to the community and the people that are living in them, and the overall society. And so we're definitely do not always meet the mark. We've had issues along the way, many issues, but it's something that we try very hard to keep calibrating and keep finding the way. As one last point, this home was a semi-modular, semi-stick built. It was actually moved on the road, so we claim it as modular. This is stick built. This is stick built. This is SIPS panels. This is steel frame, and this is one of the foam houses. And so it's all about calibrating and adjusting and going with your givens and variables. So good luck, and I can't wait to see what everybody produces.
Fantastic, Marianne, thank you very much. That's some really sound pieces of advice there from you for everyone preparing design competition entries, and also great to see your updating of the Vitruvian triangle as well, looking at affordability, resiliency, and beauty. So 3 good things for one to keep in mind. Um, Coming on now to our third speaker, who is Hailegebriel. And Mikhail is an assistant lecturer at the Ethiopian Institute of Architecture and a general practitioner whose master's study focused on housing and sustainable development. Mikhail researches connections between social, cultural, and economic justice in urban development and works to identify better solutions for real lived problems. And he will speak to us today about housing in Addis Ababa. So Mikhail, I can see you've got your slides ready to go, and we were having some slight trickiness with your video earlier, but hopefully get the audience a chance to see you so they know who's speaking. But over to you when you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Harriet. It was a good introduction, and I'm happy to be part of this architectural challenge webinar. So to begin with, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I'll be discussing 2 points for today. One is about adapting spaces, what we can learn from the existing slums when we go forward into this rapid urbanization and mass housing provision. There should be something that we can take from the existing fabric of the living neighborhoods. That's one of the points I discuss. And the second is, and the final point will be about community participation, because as the other said, community participation is one of the critical elements in providing a sustainable housing, since the community are going to be the end users. We need their involvement as much as possible. Okay, so I'll start with adapting spaces. So for adapting spaces, I took the case of Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. As you can see on this map, we can see since 1975 how the urban growth have taken place. It has taken place in a very rapid manner. This is due to mainly two factors. One is due to continuous migration from the rural and the secondary cities, and the other is a very strong need to develop the city in order to satisfy the macro economy of the whole country, since Addis Ababa is the main capital city of the country. Okay, next. So to give you an idea of the characteristics of slum neighborhood within the city, first it was founded by the king around 1886, King Minilik, and then there was kind of informal settlement because of it was just the foundation of the city, and there was no a very regularized way of managing land. And then when we come to 1975, there was this Marxist-oriented governing system, which tried to formalize the informal development, which began from 1886. So in doing that, there was some attempts in creating formalized spaces and a fair distribution of land between the society, and trying to meet social justice. And coming to the third era after 1992, it was market-oriented urban development strategy. So it was mainly focused on, formalizing these informal houses, making sure every land is contributing as much as possible to the market. So in doing so, the slum houses were being influenced and eradicated, and the inhabitants were being relocated with a very less sensitivity to their demands and to their livelihoods. So next. So like 70% of the housing within the city, it is owned by the government, and it's informal, and their condition, we can say that it's in a very deteriorating manner in terms of material, and it also have a very poor infrastructure, and it's occupied by the low income tenants. So this was another reason to go forward to mass housing, because these houses need to be replaced by new system. So coming to going in detail to the slum housings, um, even though they should be refurbished and new mass housing should be produced, there is a lot that we can learn from the neighborhoods of the slums, because it has been mutating for like a century, and through that time all the inhabitants came up with their own method of appropriation of spaces. They create a very intimate manner of creating connection between the inside and the outside, and they have their social, cultural, and economic values, because partly they usually use part of their house to create businesses, and usually there are spaces inside their house which are considered semi-public, so that neighbors and other people could interact with the inhabitants. So there were these kinds of cultures, and this culture, as I've told you, is an output of like a century-year-old mutation of this whole neighborhood.
Mikhail, if you can hear me interfering, I think we lost you just for a second there, and it might be work perfect. Yeah, trying switching off your camera.
Okay. Um,
We can hear you now very clearly.
okay. Maybe going back to some points if you missed what I said. Um, okay, or we can go to the next slide. So the the government's policy for the future is to meet the millennial development goals. So in doing that, because of the points I raised about slum housings, how the infrastructure and the building materials are deteriorating, that's one reason. And the other reason of the government to meet the millennial development goals, it went with proposing mass housing as a solution for the low and middle income society. And in doing so, there was lots of relocation from the inner city to the outskirts, and outskirts lands are used basically to provide mass housing, and inner city parts are going to be used to develop a more strong macro markets for the city and for the whole country. Next. So this was the type of mass housing the government provided. It's condominium housing. Basically, the major considerations in providing these kinds of mass housing was minimizing the cost as much as possible through the method of construction and the usage of material. And the other is just meeting a very generic and um, we can say standard kind of prototyping, like studio houses, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom. That was the basic consideration. Beyond that, there was not as such a very rich study of the existing fabric and the existing lifestyle of the people who are going to be relocated from the inner city to this mass housing neighborhoods, which are going to be located in the outskirts. Okay, next. So to give you a very brief uh, uh, critics of the mass housing, one is it has a very spatial rigidity, which means there were no flexibility of spaces in terms of use. The building materials used are rigid. Mostly they are hollow concrete blocks, so we cannot manipulate the spaces as much as we want. That was one of the characters of the building. The other is the shared spaces within the buildings were the only narrow corridors shared by the housing units. So that culture of socializing and creating intimate space between the inside and outside was being compromised for the inhabitants. And the third character of this mass housing was the there were some facilities provided by the developers for public use, but they were located too far from the houses, so they basically don't use it. They just create committees and rent it out for other businesses. So the intended activities were not being exercised per se. Next. So these are evidence of how the people who moved into these condominium houses were um, trying to adjust to the spaces. But as you can see, the corridors are being used for other activities, different layers of activities. And unfortunately, these kinds of space usage created also a concern of security because there was no a very good intimate relationship in terms of visual connection between the inside and outside spaces. So this was done at the beginning, but through time they even stopped doing this because things were being stolen by strangers, and so it was not per se a safe neighborhood to live in for them. Um, this is also a desperate move by the inhabitants to introduce nature and the idea of living on the ground level. They created their own garden system on the buildings, but due to lack of good water resource, because water does not reach to the upper levels, they were having trouble watering the plants. And again, when their opportunity comes, even the plants were being stolen by strangers. So the social, the social cultural living style of the people was being highly compromised. And this is a typical culture by the Ethiopian people to bring out spices for sun drying. And this was usually done in a cul-de-sac or a courtyard space where everything is secured, and these activities were well managed in the previous slum neighborhoods. But here, um, again, there was no space provided for such kind of activities, so they just do it on corridors. So neighbors complain, and there were social, conflicts being created through, but because of this. Okay, next. This is just to show another lifestyle or character of living inside the city. This is a small mattress found inside the living room. So they usually turn their living room into bedrooms during the night. This is just to show how spaces could be used for multi-purpose um, activities. But this place could also be used for business during the daytime. So during daytime, they might, in the previous cultures, they use it to create businesses like local drinks or small spices and fruit shop could be included in their living room during the daytime, and for the night, they turn it into a sleeping space. So they have that culture in the previous layouts. So this is a hypothesis developed by myself during my bachelor's study. Uh, it was to counter the mass housing proposed by the government, because it seemed like it was unfair to the spatial qualities and the social justice of the people living there. So the first is the first intention of the hypothesis that I developed is to reintroduce the open spaces within the multi-layered buildings. So create this open punched kind of semi-open spaces within the buildings and try to create a cul-de-sac or a courtyard-like character within multi-leveled layers, and also create a very good flow between buildings to allow movement through the buildings, because that's one of the characters of the slum neighborhoods, which allowed a very good breeze in terms of environment and nature. So with this hypothesis, the second layer beyond producing these open spaces on the multi-layers was to use one of the building elements as a tool to manipulate spaces and create space flexibility and adaptability. So the facade of the building through mechanical and technical systems could be manipulated into creating the missed qualities and the missed values of the spaces that were found within the slums, so that we can adapt those spaces inside um, in a bigger scale, a formal building, but in a very detailed scale, a very dynamic and playful spaces. So this plan shows a sample of the exercise. Here we can see 4 houses combined together. Um, so if you see the shaded gray parts, they all are changed for the different 4 scenarios. So this could be achieved through the manipulation of the facades of each units, so that we can create a flow of space between the inside and the outside, and each unit could manipulate the spaces according to their needs, creating different kinds of space values. So the scenario possibilities are endless. These are just to show 4 types of scenarios, but in the general form, the whole 4 units will be placed in a stable manner, but only the inside, the gray part, the shared part, will be the dynamic one. Okay, next. So if we combine those 4 units into a bigger scale, we can create a mass housing building. This is one of the floor plans. You can see a zoomed in version of the possible activities that could be done within the building. So we can turn this into a mass housing. So at the end of the day, we'll see from a distant or from a bigger scale, um, seemingly a rigid building, but when we zoom in into a housing unit level, we can see how we can turn the building into a very dynamic space manipulating plan through the usage of facades. Next. So the whole idea of these adapting spaces was to create a mediating system between the existing uh, slum neighborhood and the possibly new introduction of mass housing, because as I've explained, there is a very much gap between them. So one of the methods I developed, as I've showed you, is to use the facades, so that we can create the lost spaces and the lost qualities of the slum neighborhoods within inside of the multi-story buildings. So that's just one approach. Another approach that other architects and students could develop is create any kind of tool to create a mediating element between the lost spaces and the standardization of mass housings. So that being said about adaptability, now we can go to the community participation part. The reason why I raised the community participation is as we have seen in the slave neighborhoods, spaces are being used in a very complex manner. So just to study it with professionals like architects and urban planners would be unfair for the research. So involving the direct people who were developing these spaces for the last century would be a very good strategy to come up with sustainable space creation strategies. So in general, throughout the globe, it was in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the idea of community participation was introduced. And since then, there were some signs how the community could contribute to the development of mass housing in terms of space design. And going onwards, our aim is to create a sustainable urban development. And in that manner, the community participation should be increased to the maximum possibility. So this is the community participation ladder diagram. It shows how less or how much we can involve the community within our projects. So currently, the best approach, the best practice within at least my country, Ethiopia, is the consult level. That's the maximum that the developers and the government could do. They just consult the community through community creation, and the committee created representatives. So they just consult them. They just make them aware of what they are doing, but the extent of the influence that the community would have on the development is very limited, and the failure of the mass housing by the government is one of the evidences why not participating, allowing the community to participate in the mass housing development is not a good idea. The maximum possible participation of the community should always bring about the best output for sustainable development. It's just a matter of management, and maybe it might compromise some efficiency in regards of time and cost, but for the long run, I believe it's for the best sustainable development approach to involve the community as much as possible. So two things you can take from my presentation is that whenever you're developing mass housing, for example, for especially for the low-income people, it's always critical to study how the people live, how they manipulate their spaces, and try to adapt those spaces in a strategic manner and recreate them in mass housing. That's one point you can take. And the second is try as much as possible to participate the community within the design, because they have stories and skills that they can bring to the design that not even the professionals could come up with. So thank you.
That was excellent, Mikhail. Thank you very much. That was a really clear case study to take us through from beginning with visuals all the way to your conclusions and the designs that you've come up with. There's much, much to think about and talk about from that. We'll come now to our fourth speaker, who's Ben Bolgar. Ben is an architect, design director of a development company, senior director at the Princess Foundation, visiting fellow at Kellogg College, Oxford, and an honorary fellow at the University College of Estate Management, which is a run-on sentence of affiliations and achievements. So he has experience in master planning and design strategies for projects to build thousands of homes, as well as in developing designs for prototype houses that push the boundaries of environmental performance by using a palette of natural and replenishable materials and traditional forms adapted to meet current needs and ways of living. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Harriet. I'll attempt to share my screen if I may. Okay, I thought very briefly, I'll just race through a project I started working on over 10 years ago now. Wow, it's a long time, which was called the Natural House, the Prince's Natural House. And I won't have time to go into too much technical detail, but it was a challenge that the Prince of Wales set us to build a healthy, attractive and affordable home on the Building Research Establishment's Innovation Campus in Watford. The Building Research Establishment helps the government in England write building regulations and codes, and they were set up in 1921. So they're a place that essentially tests buildings and building products. Just to give you the context, these are some of the other houses on the park, and there's this idea about innovation has got to look wacky. I mean, obviously there's some logic, as you can see from orientation to some of these homes, but I think this is very much, particularly 10 years ago and even so now, this idea that the innovation, immediately creates something that most consumers would find perhaps difficult to live with, which again was something we were struggling with. So because we've been working on a lot of urban design projects at the time, we were doing planning for quite a few new settlements. Of course, we thought that sustainability and green building isn't just about the box. It's not just about the energy efficiency of the house itself. It's actually about lifestyle and densities and all of those things that we've heard about previously in terms of the relation to the city. And so obviously, if you build a terraced house, an attached house, as you can see, this is a CGI of that house put into context. There's less surface area. You've immediately got a more efficient house. We've learned from the 18th and 19th century in the UK that a lot of these terrace houses underwent massive change, going from single family dwellings to multiple family occupancy and all the way back to single family dwellings, even mix of uses, non-residential uses, et cetera, et cetera. So we were trying to make the case in our project and its associated exhibition that it's really not just about the house as an individual entity, it's about how it sits within its urban context, and it needs to be designed for that and for that resilience. Then, of course, we got onto the materials. What are we going to make it out of? And we run summer schools, so we actually mocked up with students and building professionals these two wall sections. And we decided to explore two systems at that summer school. The one on the left is hemp lime, which you can either spray and pour like we did here. This was tamped, or it can be pre-dried and put into panels, and you can sort of erect it in its dried form. And on the right, these are sort of a lot of buildings in France and Germany are built out of these bricks, aerated clay blocks, which again, we decided to go with because the UK market is principally masonry. I think that's going to change as we move towards lower carbon still. It might shift towards timber, but it's essentially a masonry culture we have in this country. And of course, you learn quite a lot by putting up and building wall sections and how to detail them, etc. What you'll notice with both of those is we're exploring solid wall. Again, in the UK, almost all construction is cavity wall construction in residential. And of course, with higher energy performance, those cavities are getting wider and wider. So we looked at, for speed and efficiency, whether we could revert back to a single skin, solid wall, mono wall block. Just in terms of materials, again, the Prince, as you may know, is very keen on natural materials. 100 years ago, there were principally 55 building materials, and most of those were natural. Only lead obviously was toxic, but most of them were natural and non-toxic. Roll on 100 years and we've got 55,000 building materials, and less than half of those have been tested for toxicity. So as we're sealing ourselves up in these boxes, we need to be thinking about indoor air quality and the materials that are potentially off-gassing and the impacts on human health. The house itself, and I'm afraid I haven't got time to sort of talk you through the plans, but it was a pair of houses to demonstrate the adaptability. So essentially on the left, you've got a house that's a 2-story family house, 3-bed, that can be converted to a 5-bed with 2 of the small beds in the roof. And then on the right, you've got a bed sit on the ground floor and a 2-bedroom duplex above it. So again, we wanted to show the permutations and combinations. Essentially here, I think this is probably the most important thing about the home, and the thing that's had the most impact on the discussion and the discourse of green building in the UK, is that we decided to focus all our energy and attention on the external envelope. So this was the first, what's called fabric first approach to building. An awful lot of those other homes that you'll have seen had sort of green gizmos and gob-ons and windmills and all sorts of clever technology. Because technology was moving so fast, we wanted to see how far up the spectrum we could get by doing a low-tech approach, so completely passive, no active systems, and essentially creating thermal coherence. So it's the sort of T-cozy, making sure that all the details, all the joints between the floor, the walls, the windows, the eaves and the roof and the ridge are correctly detailed, so that you have a maximum of efficiency in the envelope itself, because that's the bit of the building that is obviously going to last the longest. You can always retrofit and upgrade technology, and so that's what we did. We redesigned the chimney stack, because obviously the historic chimney place is highly energy inefficient. It's good for air ventilation, a little bit drafty, but of course it's burning open fires and the fuel source creating smoke and going up the chimney. Interestingly, we decided to keep a high efficiency wood burning stove just as a sort of resilience measure. We've actually seen people getting their gas and electricity cut off. Those people that don't have a fire or a flue can't actually heat their home. I don't know, most of the houses we're doing now, we don't put vertical flues, but I still think there's maybe a place for having one in case various fuel systems and sources get cut off. But what you'll see in the middle is those louvers. Is essentially what's happening is that to either side of the window, there's a core that you drill. There's a piece of material in there that's essentially a bit like parachute material. And when it gets warm and wet, it goes soggy. It allows more flow through the wall, and then it goes up just through the Bernoulli effect and gets drawn up to those vents. So it creates its own sort of passive ventilation system through the home. The other thing we learned, and so I think what's really, really important is ventilation. When you're designing homes, think carefully about how air is moving and how you regulate that air. It's very important, both in terms of the materials of air, because of course, human health and comfort, and I think this is where we're using the term comfort versus temperature. If you're designing a house for a human being, which I'd suggest most of the time you are, then comfort is very, very different from temperature. And comfort and health are important, because in this sort of matrix that you can see here, or this diagram, you typically want to be getting very comfortable is between sort of 18 and 20 odd degrees centigrade. And the humidity levels tend to be, you want to be 30 to 70. If you go less than that in humidity, you're getting very dry conditions, which are good for your respiratory, bad for your respiratory systems. And then too moist, you're obviously getting things like mold buildup. So again, what you want in a building, both in terms of your ventilation systems and the materials you use, to try and keep things within those temperature to humidity levels. We also talked, and the Prince of Wales talks about the positive impacts of nature on health. So we were lucky enough to have a site directly backing onto a woodland, and we looked at and had collated some research around the benefits and positivity of natural impacts and views, which was again all part of the exhibition, and had balconies therefore that one could get out into. We also used again a lot of local supply chains and natural materials. There's a sort of end grain, quite an innovative end grain floor system that we had from Wales, and again tried to use sort of good traditional materials. We also, the layout of the house was quite adaptable. The good thing about traditional houses, they often put the bathrooms out of the back, because they sometimes originally didn't have bathrooms, which means that the internals of the house are very flexible, and you can knock rooms together, you can have folding doors, etc. A lot of contemporary housing is built with built-in wardrobes, built-in bathrooms, and it's incredibly inflexible. So again, that resilience and that adaptability is much less good in a lot of modern houses. And again, you can see one of the children's bedrooms. We worked with an interior designer who was doing a lot of recycled and upcycled materials, which again, when they're upcycled, there's a lot less off-gassing. So that was all part of the exhibition. And now in the sort of last 5 minutes, really, and I haven't got time to, again, you'll thankfully thank me for not going into all the technical stuff. But the important thing about having this house on the building research establishments is, of course, it underwent rigorous testing. So essentially the scientists got hold of these houses this pair of houses, and they put probes in the walls and all sorts of things, and they tested it for 18 months or 19 months actually, and a year of which was tested with a couple living in it, simulating a couple with a small family. So they were running extra showers, etc., etc. So it's what's called post-occupancy testing. Hardly any houses in the UK and probably across the world are actually tested. So a lot of the performance criteria that people tell you about in their houses and get you know, building regulations for a computer model, they're simulated, they're not actually real. Whereas the difference here is, of course, we've got all the performance. We modeled our calculations in the computer. We did our SAP calculations, energy performance criteria, by plugging in the U values, R values, etc. But of course, a lot of these materials are tested in the factory. The manufacturers, you know, are incentivized to up the performance levels so they can sell the product. When it's wet and windy and sunny and all the rest of it, of course, and you're putting these materials together, they perform in different ways. Let's put it like that. So again, I just didn't really go into the materials. The aerated clay block, we had a pot and beam floor with high levels of insulation. The only petroleum products were locked into the ground because they tend to be very long lasting. There's a Pavatex wood chip fiberboard insulation on the roof, hemp for external render, lime-based external render system, and then a clay tile roof with internal timber partitions. We then did a number of tests, as I mentioned, co-heating test, where you essentially heat the building up very hot and see how long it takes to cool down. And while you're doing that, take lots of thermal imaging photographs. They did long-term, you know, 8 months, 9 months of moisture profile studies, again, creating steam and putting up tents and things like that. Extreme levels of humidity. As I mentioned, you had a couple living there, simulating a small family, and then obviously all the ventilation systems were being tested as well. And this is really important because it's, you know, it's not just, as I mentioned, the temperature and the performance of the individuals. They're also getting activity diaries and questionnaires from the couple who were living there to see what the house was like to live in, what their general habits were, and some interesting stuff came out. I'll probably be able to tell you one anecdote, but not many more. So again, you've got these transducers which you drill into the cores and put 3 cores in the walls. You've got then moisture. They put these tents up and then put steam and various bits and monitor how deep into the wall it's going, how quick it takes to dry out. And then they, as you can see, they force the humidity at different temperatures. The co-heating test, where they're thermal imaging and looking at how long things take to cool down and what's the performance of the temperature and where's it going, where's the heat going, where's the heat loss going. And then air tightness tests, you probably know, they either suck or blow, and that tests, you know, again, the efficiency of the building. It's got one of the highest levels of 0.1 for those that are interested in terms of the thermal, I mean, in terms of the air tightness, which is extremely good. So it was parged. You essentially parge the interior of the clay blocks so that you don't get any loss, and then you can control your ventilation extremely accurately. Passive ventilation stacks were really interesting. What particularly was encouraging was that, you know, we didn't have those active horrible fans that you get in bathrooms that are necessary to take out all the moisture. And these passive systems, you can see the green graph there, you know, with a 5-minute hot shower, almost, you know, very, very quickly, all of the humidity is basically gone through passive vent systems out. And then we're monitoring temperature profiles through the wall at different seasons, which is kind of pretty important. And also making sure, obviously, that you don't get interstitial condensation, because then you get the buildup of mold, etc. It's one of the things in cavity walls, you get all sorts of nasty things growing inside them, which if then it transfers to the indoor air, it isn't particularly pleasant. And then the ventilation, this was interesting. We suddenly had spikes. I mean, the CO2 levels are important because, again, hardly anybody monitors carbon dioxide levels, and yet very poorly ventilated homes. You know, obviously you're just breathing in the more people are in it. You're not getting oxygen changes. We actually found CO2 levels were spiking in the bedroom, and the couple felt it was such fresh air that you got, not cool, but fresh air in the building, oxygenated air, that at night they were overriding the system and closing down the vents. And so we came to a compromise where they sort of opened it a little bit more, and then were happy they could get to sleep. And then we monitored. We had actually had a very extreme summer, unusually for England, some high temperatures, you know, right up in the 30s, but actually we didn't get overheating, although because of the large windows on the first floor, we did actually get, you know, essentially, I think we'd probably put some eyebrows on it and some solar shielding. My alarm's gone off, so that's my 15 minutes done. And luckily, this is my second to last slide. So what was great is all of that data then goes back into a computer model. So BRE have this computer model. You've now got the actual data from 18 months of testing. They stick the real data into the computer, and then they can take that computer model and turn it upside down and stick it in the Antarctic. And it's kind of do all sorts of exciting things with it. But I'm pleased to say that the building actually performed better when tested than it did when it was modeled. So it outperformed what's normally called the performance gap. And what do we learn? Well, obviously we were pleased to learn we got to see what performed better and worse, but overall the house was well detailed. I think really the thing that most people, because it gets 35,000 visitors a year or something like that on the park, is that everybody said that a lot of the houses, because you haven't got, you know, when the people had stopped living there, you don't get the smells of bread cooking, aftershave, all that kind of stuff. So you can really smell the houses, and a lot of the other houses you could smell the off-gassing, whereas this was very good air quality. People commented on the fact it was the only house that didn't smell and it had a good feel internally. I think the most important thing for me is to think of the house as essentially a bit like a body. It has a biology. So when you leave that house and lock it up, essentially, you can see the cores, the drilled cores either side of the window. That house essentially is looking after itself. So as I said, when it's hot and sort of moist, the material passively is just sort of loosening. There's more airflow through the building. Some of that moisture is then being soaked up into the walls because they're airtight walls, but they're still breathable because they're clay. So the moisture's going in, excess moisture is going and being exhausted out of the stack effect. And essentially the building self-regulates in the way that the human body regulates. So it's very low tech, very low maintenance, but very healthy. It was also, as I mentioned before, the sort of the first fabric first house, which now has become the norm. The sensible way to deal with things is fabric first. But they're still not importing the monoblock. They're still not making the single skin block in the UK. They make the internal blocks because they see that as competing with concrete. But they don't want to make the external blocks, the brick companies, because they think it competes with bricks. So again, it hasn't sort of gone to market in the UK because it's still obviously more expensive and not as energy efficient to be importing. But I think, you know, as an exercise, extremely interesting. I certainly learned a lot. And I just encourage you to think about, as I say, the biology, the building, the ventilation of the building, and the natural materials that you have in terms of encouraging human health. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Excellent. Another case study and bringing us through the technical aspects and the design features and all sorts of things for participants to think about. So fantastic to bring the talks to a close, and we can move now into questions. We've got a few that have come through on the chat already. So just to remind anyone, if you have something you'd like to put to one of the speakers, just type it in the Q&A box. A first one, which has come from Modular, which Marianne, I think you could answer, but actually others, you certainly could as well. His question is about the embodied energy, sort of the carbon inherent to building materials that get used, and security concerns with buildings. So saying that if you're building in a place where you know that you are going to want to have, for example, bars on the window, how do you get around some of the, how do you sort of marry those two together? Is that something that you've had to think about in any of your projects, Marianne?
Our biggest issue during the Katrina project wasn't the finished building, it was the job sites. So in those cases, some of the ones that we brought in modular were great because the job site was sealed up. Once the job site's sealed up, especially if you have impact windows, it helps. We don't put bars on windows. We haven't needed to, luckily. And on the embodied energy, probably Ben knows a lot more on that than I do, but one thing that we're finding over here, which is kind of changing a lot, is that wood is now being seen and recognized as a more sustainable material in some ways because of the embodied energy. So it's canceling out some of the things we used to think about the way that we were doing sustainable homes over here. So I'm not an expert, but we're just starting to dabble in understanding that maybe we should be looking in other ways at the buildings we're doing.
Great, good, thank you. I hope that helps, Mahmoudul. Another one, actually, which is a point from Robert for you, Mikhail, and Robert's wondering if you're familiar with Christopher Alexander's work, which focuses on the pattern language that exists within nature, but also in certain principles of design. He's seeing that some of the plans that you'd outlined in your research for your degree were looking like they could be almost within that pattern language. Do you know anything of Christopher Alexander, or what was that something you reflected on when you were putting your research together, or it just happened quite naturally?
Unfortunately, it happened naturally.
That's good.
It's the first time I heard of Christopher Alexander, but I believe it is an inevitable output of trying to understand and study the pattern and the nature of these kinds of inhabitants settlements. So I believe it's one of the very inevitable outputs while we're studying slum neighborhoods. I don't know if I answered well. Yeah.
Was perfect. Yes. No, and a wonderful thing that, something like a pattern language that, there's so many things that would connect to it and be part of it with it doesn't mean that they need to have knowledge that is what they're part of, but they're good works, and we can talk about those separately offline. Another question, which is looking at the density. So Marianne, a lot of the projects that you showed looking at modular and other types of build, were those done that way, sort of single house, single plot, because that's the pattern of living in those areas, rather than trying to make denser blocks?
A couple of reasons. So in the US, 75% of residential property is zoned across the country. 75% is zoned single family housing. In the other areas, you have Manhattan that's only 15%, and you have places out in California and Texas that are 90-something%. So everywhere we're building, we're confronting that. We're doing some duplexes, and we could do some quadplexes. What's interesting is just today or yesterday, we had a row of townhouses we were doing because we want to do attached houses. And then ran into an issue that we were going to be delayed for another 6 months just to get it permitted and deal with it. And in the end, instead of doing 4 townhouses with 4 ADUs, we're going to do 2 duplexes, get the same units counts. We're going to lose two ADUs. We'll just do 2 of the ADUs in the back. But we're not able to get the densities we want. We had a duplex we were going to build with an ADU in the backyard, but the parking requirements meant that we have to ditch the ADU. So we're trying to balance what we would love to do and want to do with market realities and just stay in a business. So the single family, we can have the smaller single family just moving along because it's so easy to do, and then try and fight for the other stuff, knowing that has longer lead time.
Great. Before coming to Orna, maybe on a similar theme, to look at density of urban versus rural and less dense, which, Orna, you were speaking about just at the end of your presentation, shifts in places we're living. I wonder, Ben, would you comment maybe on the natural house, which I think maybe had some designs for scalability, thinking of it in a more urban context, and to speak to any of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's not dissimilar in the UK to America in that developers like to sell detached houses because they feel that the values they get for a detached house are greater. We found in some of the projects we've been involved with, we've challenged that, and there was a specific project that was done by the Duchy at Poundbury where they for that reason the developer said, look, we really don't feel comfortable trying to sell terraced houses or attached housing. So they built, it was interesting, they built 5 detached houses, a couple of meters between the houses, and then they built 5 terraced attached houses as a row. And they found, but obviously for the same budget, you're saving a wall on each house. They had bigger kitchens so they were building for exactly the same amount, and you've got a bigger kitchen for the terrace. And of course, well, not of course, but essentially the attached sold for more money and quicker. So once they got that evidence, they did a little pilot very sensibly. You can't ask people to take risks unnecessarily. They then had enough confidence to increase, not to do all terraces, but to do more terraces. And so what we've found in most of our developments is we can do that. The other incentive, which is good, is of course, the more you attach your houses, the greater density you get. So you make the argument to the developer that rather than have these crammed in, rabbit hutches, which give you a poor sense of townscape, they give you bad streetscape, and they're all crammed together because they're trying to shove as many as they can on the land. You can actually have very generous streets by doing more attached houses and get greater values. So I think when you look at it as, rather than looking at the individual unit, you look at it in a phase, your figures change and you can make a different argument to developers, because ultimately we need to be built, whether we like it or not. If we want to get to lower zero carbon, we need to be building more attached housing. I think for the most part, that's, most people would agree, I think.
Yes, yep, no, great. And Orna, I think thinking about that urban to rural, rural to urban, some of the other points and issues that you mentioned in your talk about construction supply chains, availability of materials, costs of things, access, and so forth. Do you see some move towards rural and some needing to stay in a city? I don't know, some of the trends you've already seen, is that going to make some things better? Is it going to make most things worse? Obviously, you can't draw preemptive conclusions before doing the research, but whether you might speak a little bit more about the urban and rural.
Yes, sure. I would be glad to. I think that the first point that I wanted to address, and that is an assumption that the COVID-19 will result in migrations from expensive cities to less expensive, under inverted commas, rural areas, and that will solve the crisis that is related to lack of affordability. And this is something that we need to deconstruct, and that will not happen. Because what we are seeing right now, and that will not happen for several reasons. So we cannot count on telework resulting in migrations from expensive cities to less expensive rural areas, and therefore solving naturally the affordability crisis. So that has its limitations for several reasons. First of all, I think that we have to, in terms of thinking about the possibility of migration, and therefore possibility that there will be the demand for housing will or for housing product that you were explaining will increase in the rural areas opposite to urban areas. We have to consider that, for instance, the data shows right now that in the EU and G20 countries, fixed broadband download speeds in rural areas are close to 50% less or slower than those in cities. And therefore, if you want to move and be able to work remotely, you will be asking yourself, where is it that I can in fact move? So that therefore we cannot really see, we cannot really count on these natural trends that will go smoothly in all the rural areas. The other thing that we are seeing, that in those rural areas that are equipped with broadband, we already see increase of housing prices for second homes. We saw that in Czech Republic, of all places, where the prices of second homes have doubled or tripled. There are popular areas as well for second homes. The question is also who will be able to move. And then if we kind of look at the who will be able to move, that actually kind of translates to who will be able to purchase an architectural product that will be available in specific area. I think that the other issue that I wanted to actually make is, note as well is depending also the demand side, we will have to see in terms of income, which population groups can move, and this will be probably the high income groups, but this has to be kind of analyzed better as well, because we have to see also the household composition here. For instance, people with school children will not necessarily be able to move, even though they have the possibility to telework, and there is a rural area that is equipped with broadband in proximity. So we have to actually make more research into what is going on. And I think that most important thing to think about at the moment is not count on this potential migrations to solve the housing affordability problems. The housing affordability problems remain, and they will remain for the low income population, and therefore the work of everybody working on affordable housing solutions and is critically important at this time. So that's what I would like to say. I hope that I answered your question. If not, you please do give me a second one.
No, you did, Orna, and you also forecast ahead, because the next webinar next month is going to be on the urban and the rural. So you're even getting us ahead to that next session. So thank you for that. Reflecting on, Marianne, what you had put forward of the givens and the variables with any side in any project, I think is a really smart way for people to get thinking about what it is that they're going to design and for where. And Mikhail, thinking of the example that you gave of the blocks of housing being put forward by the government and some of the real shortcomings within those, that so many of the givens and of the variables being worked with there are patterns that would repeat in so many cities all around the world. But I wonder, from a practical angle, thinking maybe to help people looking to enter the design competition, to put forward a design, I'll put this to each of you, but starting, Mikhail, maybe with you, what would be a piece of advice that you would give to somebody, where to start with either speaking to a community, how can they choose, how would it be best to choose a site, and then maybe to speak to the community that would be being thought about in the design that they're going to be putting forward, thinking about your own work? Any advice that you'd offer?
Okay. So currently, in the housing provision strategies, there are theoretically two methods. One is the government is the solo provider of the mass housing, and the second is a partnership between the private developers, the public, and the government would be the administrative part. So first is what I would advise is go into the community and try to come up with a representative, like a committee group that could represent the community, and that could have a direct involvement in the whole process of the mass housing provision. So in this part, what the architects and the designers could contribute is maximize cost minimization. So as much as cost efficiency is made, trying to technicality and through technical methods, we can minimize costs of building design, and we can compromise the time usage by involving the community. But if we come up with a sustainable and very sound space design system that's cost efficient, we can convince the private developers, which we can turn the buildings into a mixed building, so that it won't be just a housing, but it also could provide a business generating spaces that will attract the attention of the private developers. So if there is a strong bond between the private developers and a public representing committee, and they go with a proposal to the government. The government is willing to provide, at least in our country's policy, the government will provide the basic infrastructure, land, such as basic infrastructure such as power, sanitary access, and all the other infrastructures. So what our advice is, create a community representative committee. That's one thing. And the architects and the urban developers will be a mediating part between the private developers and the community. Try to come up with a cost efficient and sound kind of proposal, and submit those kinds of proposals to the government. So minimize the headache of the government. So they will probably go with these kinds of plans.
Great, good advice. Thanks, Mikhail. Ben, maybe coming to you next. Where would you suggest that somebody looking to enter, where should they start? Should they think about first, either a given or a variable?
Well, maybe it's a bit, I'll give a London-centric answer, but I think it does apply globally on the basis of what Orna was saying in her presentation about prices. So if you think in London at the moment, the average property price is 17 times the average salary. We wrote a report on that 8 years ago and it was 12 times. So in that period of time, it's gone up that much. So, and obviously one of the reasons why that's happening is they're not making any more land in London. So once you constrain land, particularly with the green belt, people are just going up. You see the suburbs are built, it's very difficult to develop, as we know, brownfield sites, and so you've got a constraint on land, and so prices just go up and up and up. There's a couple of policies that I've been contributing to recently through the housing and local government, which I think are being taken seriously by the Secretary of State at the moment, which is this idea of good densification and incentivizing people through policy to develop land. And one of the things that was done was this idea of street vote. Well, one was the idea of permitted development to add a story onto a house, so people immediately had the rights to put on. Then there was this idea of mansard votes, where you could vote on the street to essentially add a story onto the top without needing planning permission. Then there was a policy around street votes, where a whole street, imagine you've got a suburban street out in the outer zones, you could actually take a vote with that street, and if you've got a consensus, then that whole street could turn one house on a plot into 4 terraced houses with maybe even some streets at the back, and they would make quite a lot of money out of doing that. So they even looked at how much a typical householder would make. They could still obviously live in one of those houses after the development, but they'd be essentially adding 3 more houses. And then just recently I was chatting to the person doing the research last week about mews. So in England you have the mews house, you had bigger houses at the front of the street, and in the back they were often carriage houses where the sort of park the carriage and the horses would be in the back of the block. But a lot of those, particularly in post-war development, are just horrible garages and just very poor use of land. So the idea about block votes, that people who live within an urban block could vote to develop mews houses. And I think, in terms of affordability and getting a lot of, they've become quite attractive places to live. They tend to be single aspect. So a mews house, essentially the party wall, the garden wall is onto someone's back garden, but they're single aspect, but the street that's between 7 and 8 meters wide becomes a sort of shared space. So you often get ground floor sliding doors, and then people come out into the street, and when the weather's nice, that they actually can sort of live out on the street, and they put plants out of the front. You go sort of 1 meter strip. A lot of them have nice inverted living. So on the ground floor, you get the bedrooms, a big space, loft space up top. Some of them have roof terraces, to compensate for the lack of space. So I think there's a lot to be said for looking at land creatively and understanding, using your architectural skills to think about how to make things that are affordable, energy efficient, but also very livable, sort of lifestyle. They'd be attractive to people who are getting on the housing ladder, younger people, or even elderly downsizing. Because again, in most parts of the world, the critical issues are finding attractive housing to encourage people rattling around, an old couple rattling around in the 5-bed to downsize. And likewise, how do you get younger people on the housing ladder? So I begin to think about those types of issues.
Yep, Good thought. So for anybody thinking of choosing an urban site, think outside the box in terms of on what land that actually could be and could be done and what that would mean. Yeah, good. Well, maybe we'll come to you, Marianne, to finish with your bit of advice. So Orna, I wonder to you, what would be your piece of advice, where to start for somebody thinking of putting forward a design to the competition?
I think that in this case, I would have to say that my colleagues that are still practicing architecture are the one to be listened to very attentively. I deal with comparisons between countries, 56 countries, and actually this session has been very refreshing for me to go back into the basis of my training as an architect. So I will leave the floor and advice to practicing architects. I'm a policy analyst and a policy advisor at this time. After a decade, I think that they should be given the floor at this time. So Marianne.
good advice to advise that people listen to the others. That's absolutely valid.
Yes, I mean, I can tell you more about the lack of affordability and this stuff like that, but I think that if you're thinking about winning this competition or getting ahead, listen to practicing architects. So
good stuff. Well, we needed your scene setting, but Marianne, let's come to you.
So my advice is be extremely clear about what you are solving for. You've heard such a range today, and even within each of our work, there's a range, and then between our work, there's a wider range. Take what works for you. If you try and solve all of the world's problems, you will not get very far. So there's a natural tendency, human nature is everything is global and everything is local. So if you create a solution for a very clear problem, you will most likely be able to actually have a global solution. When we designed the Katrina Cottage, it was very specifically the alternative to the FEMA trailer. Stop. Yet within that, we had a mission statement that it needed to be affordable, sustainable, the Vitruvian triad, and economic. That was full stop what we were doing. Now we can apply it to all sorts of other things, but we were extremely clear in our design and in our execution, and kept coming back to that. So choose what you are solving for and be very clear along the way if you're straying from that, and make hard choices that if you found, there's rarely, maybe there's going to be a savant that finds the silver bullet, but it doesn't typically exist. And what is, I think, the most interesting is the fact that it doesn't exist, and that we take all of the imperfections and all of the challenges, and like Orna had said, the opportunity of this moment to take the issue that is in your local community that you know best, and make that something that is so clear that we can all be inspired by it and use it in our communities locally. But don't design for my community, design for yours, and just keep checking back, keep design, move forward, and then check logic. And if you do that, if you keep your compass aligned, you will find success.
Wonderful advice. Thank you very much. Well, we can write up all of these points, get a sort of a Q&A and kind of how-to guide going for participants on the challenge website, so you can all keep track of the good bits of advice. So we will finish with questions there, I think, because we've run a little bit over time already, in fact, 20-something minutes over time, but absolutely worth it to have heard all we have from our four speakers, who I'd like to thank now very, very much for being with us. So Orna, Marianne, Michael, and Ben, thank you. And also to participants for joining us, and to Juliet Butler and Lauren Holland for making all of this possible. And also thanks to our sponsors, Ali Reza and Mina Sagarchi and Stanhope Gate Architecture, likewise have made this possible. You can catch up with the recordings of the first 5 sessions if you haven't seen them already or want to watch them again, and you can share them. They're all on our YouTube channel, and you can link to them also through the challenge website. And if you've joined or watched 4 webinars, we have a short quiz that you can take in order to earn a certificate of attendance from us as well. So do take advantage of that. And just a reminder, and I will bring up the details now so that you can see what I'm going to be saying on screen, which is that you can register to join the challenge at challenge.intbau.org, which means you'll get emails with everything that's upcoming in terms of sessions, Q&As, networking events, and otherwise. So do have a look on there, and you'll get details of the 7th session, which will be coming up at the end of February on the urban and the rural. So that's it for this session, and thank you very, very much once again to our speakers, to participants, and to all who've made this session possible.